What's up, guys, and welcome to another Scourge of War video. Now, before we get into it here, I know that I still have one more scenario to go in Scourge of War Les Saint-Jours, the full battle of La Cefale as the Austrians, and I am planning to get to that. It's just I need to find the time to do it. It's a 4-hour scenario, and then I need to do another 4 hours of commentary on top of it. And it's not always easy for me to find the time to actually go and sit down and do a 4-hour playthrough. Um, if you look at the dates that I uploaded for, the last couple of Les Saint-Jours videos, you'll see that they correspond to, a lot of holidays, things like Christmas and Thanksgiving and stuff where I had, more time than I normally do to be able to do these things. So I haven't forgotten about it. I'm still eagerly looking forward to doing it, but I just need to find a nice block of time where I can actually, sit down, and even if I got to split it up and, maybe record the playthrough on one day and find another day to actually do the commentary for it. But I just need to find like a 4-hour block to actually sit down and do it. So I am looking forward to doing that. I love the Les Saint-Jours mod, but briefly, we're going to diverge from that series of videos just and because the other day I there was a thread posted in on the Norbsoft forum where someone was asking me about um, a, a video I had for command and control and some of the strategies and the tactics that I use uh, in the game so that they could get a better understanding of how it works and how to use them and why I use them. And in the course of responding to them, it kind of dawned on me that I don't really have such a video. I don't really have any one video that is solely dedicated to kind of the strategies and the tactics that I use in this game. It's covered in a whole bunch of different videos. It's just it kind of grows and grows and grows throughout the series, and um, unless you follow the whole series of videos that I've done, there's really not one video that kind of encapsulates just the strategies and tactics that I use. There is the Grog Toolbar Demystified series, but that's much more focused on the actual interface itself, the toolbar, and while I do touch on some of the strategies and tactics that I use in the game in that series, it's mostly devoted to the toolbar itself and how that works. And it's also was done quite a long time ago. While the toolbar information is all accurate and stuff, those videos are close to 2 years old at this point, and my tactics and strategies have refined considerably even since then. So I thought maybe I would take a stab at maybe starting a new series of videos on just the strategies and the tactics that I use in this game. Um, for a lot of you guys that have been with me for a long time, have been watching my videos for a long time, a lot of this is going to be stuff you know already. This series of videos is not really going to be aimed at the veterans of my channel, you guys that have been with me for a long time. You're going to know a lot of this stuff already. It's going to be old news to you. So it's not really aimed at you guys. You can, of course, watch if for some reason you just enjoy hearing the sound of my voice. I can't imagine why that would be, but regardless, yeah, it's really meant for people who may, you know, just be getting into the game. And obviously, if you just find my channel, it's got 80 something videos. It could be a little overwhelming. Maybe if you're looking for something specific and it's, it could be spread out in a whole bunch of different videos. So um, basically, that's kind of my idea. I'm not committing to doing a whole series on this. I'm going to see what you guys think of it, what kind of responses I get to it, if it's helpful. If there are a lot of new people out there to begin with, I don't even really know for sure. Um, but that's kind of the general idea behind what I'm thinking about maybe doing going forward, with this and after I finish Les Saint-Jours. So today I thought I would start with the very foundations of my gameplay. where it all begins, my ultimate aim in kind of anything I'm doing, and that is the fortress. So, what is the fortress? What is it, and how does it work? And I think, yeah, maybe that's what I'll title this episode. Um, well, on the surface, the fortress is just a series of formations, but in reality, the fortress stems from a philosophy of gameplay. And to really get into that, I guess I have to kind of talk a little about myself and what my philosophy of gameplay is, because it's not one you're going to encounter, I suspect, amongst a lot of war gamers. So many years ago, a long time ago, back in young Rob's life, I used to be a competitive fighting game player, which I know is worlds away from Scourge of War Waterloo. It has nothing to do with Scourge of War Waterloo, as Scourge of War is not a competitive game. Um, but I used to play competitive fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and stuff like that. And I used to go to local tournaments and compete in them. I was never a top player or anything. I was just kind of middle of the road. I wasn't the worst. I wasn't the best. I was okay. Um, but among those outings that I used to go to, I was introduced to a book, basically on being a competitive gamer. And it was written by this guy, a professional Street Fighter player named David Serlin, and he wrote a book called "Playing to Win," which is basically a book all about kind of the mental mindset you need to become a competitive fighting game player, which again has nothing to do with anything we're talking about here. But moreover, it's a philosophy on games itself. And why do we play games? And kind of the philosophy behind that. And it boils down to the idea that the reason we play any game is to win, right? I mean, we don't play games that you can't win. What would be the point? Nobody plays tic tac toe anymore. Why? You can't win at tic tac toe. Every game ends in a draw. Um, so it basically boils down to this primary reason of why we play any kind of game or compete in any kind of sport or do anything uh, in that regard. And now that's not to say that's the only reason to play a game. Obviously, any baseball player will tell you they play the game for the love of the game, and they love baseball. A football player will tell you they love football, or a chess player, professional chess player, will tell you that he loves the game of chess, and all of that is certainly true. I love Scourge of War, but on any given night when a baseball team takes the field, or a basketball team takes to the court, or a chess player sits down to play against another player, they are playing to win. Nobody sits down at a chessboard to lose. No baseball team takes the field to lose. No fighter steps into the octagon in the UFC to lose. They all go in to win. So that's kind of the primary reason that we play any game. We're trying to win. That's the ultimate goal. So when you take that philosophy to its zenith, which is the type of player I would consider myself to be, winning becomes paramount above anything else. And that comes into conflict in a game like this more often than not because of the fact that it isn't a competitive game. It's a historical simulation. A big part of it is the reenacting of history and doing things in a historically correct way. So a lot of my strategies and tactics are certainly not to be considered in any kind of a historical light. Um, the fortress is not a historical formation. The fortress is something I invented. It's something that works in the game. It has nothing to do with history. So if you're a historian, you're going to look at this and say, this is completely unrealistic. This is not how Napoleonic battles were fought. And I would agree with you if I knew anywhere near as much about Napoleonic warfare as a historian does, which I'm not in a position to, because I'm really not a historian. What I am is a gamer that's trying to win. Um, and that's really where the fortress comes from. So, what is it? And how do we use it? Why do we want to use it? So, there are a couple of different variations of the fortress. And this here is the most basic one. When I first started playing the game, the first thing I realized that was kind of my big breakthrough um, in the game was discovering that artillery was the absolute most deadliest weapon in the game. But there was a catch. You had to be within 200 yards of the enemy for artillery to be at its most effective, to become that most dangerous weapon. Any further back, and it's not nearly as threatening. It still will get hits at 200 yards, 300 yards, 400 yards, even out to 500 yards. Beyond that, artillery in this game might as well be shooting Cocoa Puffs at you. It's completely ineffective. But within 200 yards, artillery is without a doubt the most devastating arm in the game in terms of the sheer number of casualties that it can inflict, as well as the speed at which it can inflict them. So why do we have to be within 200 yards? Well, artillery guns in this game are armed with a couple of different types of ammunition. Now, French batteries are mostly armed with a combination of shell or solid shot. This is solid shot here. This is shell, or shrapnel and canister. Right. So if we click on a gun here, right, we can see that its maximum range is 1,200 yards. Right. That's the furthest it can shoot, which is ridiculous. You're not going to hit anything really at 1,200 yards, but that's theoretically the maximum range that solid shot has. Right. But within 200 yards, we switch to canister. What canister is I guess you could liken it to turning your cannon into a giant shotgun. It's basically like a tin jar, or basically a tin can filled with a whole bunch of like little musket balls. And when you shot it, the can would burst open, and the musket balls would go flying out in a cone, very similar to what a shotgun does. Uh, and within 200 yards, this form of fire is extremely deadly. It's the most effective form of fire in the game. So when I made that breakthrough, I started bringing my guns to the front because that was where I needed to get them into close range of the enemy in order to use this canister to inflict maximum amounts of casualties. And the first thing I started noticing is that my artillery became easy prey, especially for enemy cavalry. Cavalry could come forward and run them down and capture all the guns. Even when the guns limbered up and tried to get out of there, the cavalry was faster than them. So I kept losing my batteries. So I'd bring them up, they'd start shooting, but very quickly enemy cavalry would come in and bye-bye guns, and it just didn't work. So what I had to do was find a way to get my guns to the front and keep enemy cavalry from overrunning them. So the second breakthrough I had was with learning how the charge function of enemy cavalry works. So when you click on a cavalry squadron, and let me see if I can find one here. What did I do with all my cavalry? I backed them out of the way so I could set everything up here. Okay, so here's a cavalry squadron, right? And you'll notice that when you click on the charge button, all it says is charge. That's all it does, right? There's no way to uh, there's no way to specify in this game what it is you want the cavalry to charge. It's just a charge button, and it works for the AI the same way it works for the player. And basically, the way the charge function works is the when the cavalry squadron goes into a charge, it simply charges the first unit that comes within range of it. So what that basically means is if cavalry is coming forward, presumably you've set your fortress up to face the enemy, and not that the enemy would be coming from the side or coming from behind you. You've set your formation up so that they're coming from the front. So when the cavalry comes within range to start charging, the idea here is that these squares, which are out on either side of the guns, are forward of the guns. So when the cavalry goes to charge, they can't because the squares are what's in front of them, and cavalry can't charge squares. So they really can't do anything. They simply come up and they can't do anything because their charge is blocked by squares, which they can't charge. So they can't get to the guns. So this was the first thing I figured out on how to protect artillery from enemy cavalry, is that if I put cavalry out on the flanks, and the reason I put them out on the flanks is because if I would have just put them in front of the guns, sure, I would stop the cavalry from getting to the guns, but I'd also be blocking the guns' field of fire. And the idea is we want the cavalry to come up and want to charge, but then can't. But while they're up here, the guns have a full field of fire here to just pound away on them. And that's really the basis behind what is the most basic formation or version of the fortress formation here. So it's basically distance and engagement control. By having the squares forward of the guns, right, we make it so that any cavalry unit coming towards our position has nothing within charge range except the squares, because if they press the charge button, it's just going to charge squares, and they can't charge squares. So they cannot get to the guns. So the guns are just free to shoot at them. And so it's basically a distance control, and it's a formation control. By using this formation, we are controlling what the enemy can and can't do. So they can come forward, but that's all they can do. They can't charge because they can't charge squares, which leaves our guns free to fire away at them, so to speak. And because they come up rather close, they'll be within 200 yards, which is out here somewhere, and we'll be able to use canister on them, thus being able to bring guns within the range that they are absolutely the most effective and capable of inflicting the most casualties with the most speed, and still being protected, because cavalry cannot get to them. Now, the reason you'll notice that this is an 8-gun battery, and I do have the squares squeezed in a little bit, so they're kind of overlapping the outermost guns. And the reason I do this is because I really do not want to give the cavalry any way to come forward in the center and have a way through to the guns. Perhaps they could, if I'm further out, perhaps they could come to a range where they're either equidistant or somehow closer to the guns than they are to the square, and then be able to hit the charge button and actually charge the guns. So because of the fact that when I play with artillery, I only TC the battery commander just so he doesn't leave and move his guns away. I don't actually TC the guns themselves. All the guns you can see are off TC. So you don't have to worry about the outer guns. They will move around and move in and make themselves useful. They'll find a spot from whence they can shoot. And I really just TC the battery commander because I don't want the battery to move off. This is where I've placed them, and I want them to be here. That doesn't mean the guns won't pivot or move around a little bit within their position to find the best spots to shoot and the best change to the best targets. And the AI is very good at handling that, and so I never get in the way of that. They'll switch to the right ammunitions. They'll continually target units and switch to better targets and funnel their fire correctly. So all I do is TC the battery commander just to make sure the battery placement itself stays the same. Really, I view artillery battery commanders as nothing but convenient ways to move an entire battery to a place I want to move them. So if I want to move a battery, I don't move it gun by gun. I just TC the battery commander. And am I clicked on one? Oh, I have the game paused. Excuse me. And I'll just place him, and then I can just open the formation button, hit the formation, and the entire battery will move. But that's all I view the battery commander as being important for, is just for moving the battery in its entirety. Uh, Beyond that, they serve very little function. Let me just unpause this and halt this so they're not making noise, and I'll repause the game here. Uh, Okay, so that's basically it for the cavalry version of the fortress. It's a very static formation because you're only dealing with cavalry. This is really all you need to do. Cavalry, of course, can't shoot. They only have one mode of attack, which is the charge. So this is basically you. If you're only dealing with enemy cavalry, this is largely a set up and forget it formation. You don't really need to do anything. Make sure all your units are TC'd so they don't move. They stay in square. They don't, do anything, and the squares will shoot at the cavalry. The artillery will shoot at the cavalry. They'll just make mincemeat out of the cavalry, and there's nothing the enemy cavalry can do about it, because with this formation we control both the distance management, because the squares are in front of the guns, and we control the engagement because we can shoot at them, but they can't attack us. And this formation, if you're only dealing with, again, this formation is only meant to deal with enemy cavalry alone, meaning you're just being attacked by enemy cavalry. And it can be linked together in any number of ways. You can have a formation like this, and then maybe put, if you want to move out to the left, put another battery with another square, another battery, and another square. If you don't have a whole heck of a lot of artillery to play with, you can maybe use more squares. Maybe go like this: square, battery, square. Put another square here, then another battery here, then another square, then another square, in order to lengthen the line and make the most use of the artillery that you do have available. And That's basically the gist of the cavalry version of the fortress. Like I said, it's a pretty straightforward and static formation. Once it's set up, if you're only dealing with enemy cavalry, there's really not a heck of a lot you need to do other than this. Like I said, just make sure that your squares are forward of the guns. And while I don't have any units on the screen right now, this is why the battery is limbered. The reason I set the guns up kind of this far back is because when the guns do unlimber, the guns themselves will move forward to kind of right behind the squares, and that's really where you want them. So you have to account for that when placing the battery, as well as placing your squares, is that when enemy come within range and the guns actually unlimber, the guns will unlimber and move forward of where the caissons are. This is basically where the when you place a battery, this is where the caissons move, and then when the guns unlimber, they move further forward from here. So from this position here, when the guns unlimber, they'll basically move to right within line of the very rear of the squares. And that's precisely where you want them. You don't want the guns to be too far forward where they unlimber in here, or right even with the squares, because the whole idea of this is that enemy cavalry, cannot have the option of having the guns become their target when they hit the charge button. It's only the squares that are possible choices for enemy cavalry. And that's the whole idea behind this formation. So again, it's distance control and it's engagement control. We control the distance because the squares are in front. We control the engagement because cavalry only has one mode of attack, while we have the guns and we have the squares to shoot at them. And as I said, that can be linked together in any number of ways. But that's the basic kind of bare bones gist of how this formation works. Like I said, pretty static, set up and forget. So let's go over here. And I have another version of the fortress set up here. Now, this version of the formation of the fortress grew out of uh, uh, the cavalry version. In that it is the same a core philosophy. The idea here is all about artillery, right? Keeping it close, keeping that canister fire going, and inflicting the maximum amount of casualties uh, at the fastest possible speed that we can. So this formation is designed when you're only dealing with enemy infantry, and as such, it's one of the probably more used formations that you might see in like divisional scenarios and so forth, where a lot of times it's just your infantry versus enemy infantry and artillery. Um, so the basic idea here is um, we have skirmishers set up in front of line infantry. And behind the line infantry, we have assault columns. This unit here is a line unit that I keep in rear of the artillery battery. And this unit's sole job is to supply the skirmishers. They don't really have a part in the combat itself. That's all they're here for, is to be a source of skirmishers. So all these skirmisher units out here, right? These are all 100-man groups. I have three of them: one here, one in the center, and one on the right. These all were split off from this unit here. Um, and the reason I do that and keep the have a rear unit whose sole purpose is to split off skirmishers is I'm able to have skirmishers without taking strength away from the line units up front here. So these two units here are all at maximum strength. They haven't had any skirmish units siphoned off from them. So they're full strength units because the skirmishers came from back here. And basically what the idea here is that if enemy, say an enemy brigade is coming towards your position here, um, basically enemy infantry is going to take kind of one of three possible choices as far as how they're going to make an attack. If they come forward and deploy their own skirmishers to tangle with your skirmishers, uh, that's largely an even firefight as far as the skirmishers go. Skirmishers versus skirmishers is basically a wash because um, the enemy skirmishers will have the same defensive benefits as your skirmishers as far as being skirmishers go. Skirmisher units have their own defensive benefit, which is to say they are harder to hit, they're harder to shoot at than a densely packed line unit because they're more spread out. So they don't get hit as much as a line unit is. Now, if they do that, even though it's an even fight as far as your skirmishers versus their skirmishers, it's really not because you're sitting here waiting for them. The whole idea is they have to come towards you. And in order to come towards you, they have to come within range of these. And this is always the difference maker. So you can have a whole bunch of skirmishers out here facing your skirmishers. And even if they have more skirmishers, and even if they would be getting the better of your skirmisher units, it doesn't matter. Once they come within range, these guns are going to start blowing them apart. So if they come forward with a combination of their lines and their skirmishers and basically try to do the same thing we're doing here, it doesn't matter because, again, we have the guns. Combined arms in this game largely functions the same way rock, paper, scissors functions. And that's basically what combined arms is in this game, is a game of rock, paper, scissors. And you want to make it so that no matter what, you always have something more than what the enemy has, right? So if they have, if they come at you with, rock, you want to have paper to cover rock. If they come at you with paper, you want to have scissors to cut paper, and if they come at you with scissors, you want to hit them with a rock so that they can't cut the rock. And that's basically how combined arms works in this game. Now, because of the way artillery functions on the advance, very seldom will you have to deal with enemy artillery, because when enemy artillery comes forward and you're already set up, the moment enemy artillery moves forward limbered and they come within range of small arms, they turn around. They can't unlimber within range of small arms. So small arms range is 150 yards. So where our skirmishers are set up is 150 yards forward of these skirmishers is probably around the same as 200 yards is for Canister from where the artillery is set back right up here. So there's only a 50-yard kind of area that enemy artillery has to play with where they could possibly set up and be within Canister range. And I'll just tell you from experience, the AI doesn't do that. The AI just will move its artillery forward, and 9 times out of 10, the moment they come within small arms range, they just turn around and they back way the hell up. They'll deploy 400-500 yards away where they do absolutely no good whatsoever. So it's almost a given that you are almost always going to have a one-arm advantage against the AI, because if you're setting up in a defensive formation like this, and needless to say, all of these variations of the fortress are defensive formations. I'll go into some of my attack strategies in a different video, but these are all defensive formations, whether I'm defending an objective or otherwise ground that I need to hold, whether I have already attacked and captured an objective and I now need to switch over to the defensive. These formations are geared towards stopping the enemy's advance and defending a position. They're basically stone wall, brick wall formations that basically end an enemy's advance and force them to go online and deploy and engage us at unadvantageous circumstances. So the third way they have is if they are to advance is if they're just stone cold crazy and they try and through brute force get us out of here. They come forward in assault column, and they're gonna charge. So that's why we have layers of defense here. So if an enemy battalion comes forward in assault column and drives forward your skirmishers, right? So you kind of have a couple of options of what you want to do here. So if an enemy battalion is coming forward and the first thing they're going to do is they're not setting up in line, they're continuing to come forward, and this is stuff you want to watch for. If you see them continue to move forward in column by division in the assault column and they're not stopping to form line, that in itself is a pretty good indicator that they're going to charge and that they're not planning to, because if they're going to set up in line, by the time they come within this kind of range, they would have done it already. So if enemy units come to kind of within this range here and they're still moving forward, bank on it, they're charging. Now, skirmishers never win melees. Obviously, if they're skirmishers, they're not going to do well in hand-to-hand combat. So you have a couple of options here. You can hit the retreat button, which is not present on the toolbar at the moment because that would only be applicative if we were in a combat situation, which we're not. So I don't have it on the toolbar at the moment. You can have them retreat. You could let them get hit and they'll retreat on their own with losses. I don't know why you would ever do that other than if you're just caught off guard. Or you can unsplit them. Unsplitting them before they get charged has a number of unique advantages. The first thing I'll say is this is a gamey tactic. This is abusing the game mechanics. Nothing more. There's nothing historical about it. It's completely unrealistic. It's simply abusing the game mechanics. In terms of the spirit of the game, I would call it cheating. Video games in and of themselves don't let you cheat because they don't let you do anything in game that isn't technically a legal move. What I mean by that is I couldn't do anything in the game that the game considers illegal. I couldn't say call in an airstrike, uh, you know, and have my aircraft napalm the enemy. It doesn't make any sense. It's not in the game. The game wouldn't let me do something like that. So video games are unique in that you can't actually cheat at them, because the game won't let you do anything that's blatantly cheating. Um, unless you go into the code and actually alter the game. But in terms of the spirit of the game, I would. This is walking the line. This is cheating. Uh, but doing it has a number of unique advantages. When a unit goes to charge, right? Because the skirmishers are the first thing in the front here. Uh, Anything that the battalion charges is going to be the skirmish unit because we've positioned them so that they're the first thing that gets charged. Again, this is all distance management and engagement control. We're controlling this. We're controlling what the enemy is able to charge by the way we're set up. We're saying if you're going to charge, it's going to be skirmishers because that's what we have in the front. So if the enemy unit commits to charging your skirmishers and you unsplit them, what this does is basically instantly turn the skirmisher unit into an invalid target because what happens is the moment you hit the unsplit button, the game considers the skirmisher unit to immediately become part of the parent unit again, and it happens instantaneously. So if I unpause the game here a second and I click on this unit and I hit the unsplit button, and this is the unsplit unit button right here. So I want you to watch what happens when I click uh, on this unit here, which I'm clicked on, and I unsplit it. So here we go. I'm going to click on it, and you will notice, and I'll pause the game again one more second. All right, so I'm sorry about the trumpet. Oh, well, I have the sound turned off, so only I hear the trumpet. You guys don't. Um, and I want you to notice that as soon as I did that, right, instead of being clicked on the skirmisher unit, I'm now immediately clicked on the parent unit, and the skirmisher's flag is now over here because they're immediately considered to be part of the parent unit again. They have no flag, right? You can see these other skirmish units have flags, and this one no longer does because as soon as we hit the unsplit unit button, poofed, it was gone. Um, the game basically considers units flags to be the unit itself. And the reason it's like that is because the troop sprite ratios in this game are adjustable, and so they're abstract. Now I have the game on the default sprite ratio, which is uh, in the options menu it's 0, but it's really a sprite ratio of 1 to 6, which is to say that every one sprite, every one man here represents 6 actual men. Um, but because that is adjustable, you can run the game where it's 1 sprite for every 4 man, 1 sprite for every 8, 9 man, 10 man, however you want to do it. But because of that, the game needs a more reliable way to calculate the actual location of the unit as well as the unit itself. And because the sprite ratios are adjustable, uh, the game instead uses the unit flag. So what this means is that the moment you unsplit a skirmisher unit and it has no more flag, these sprites might as well not even be here anymore. It's instantly considered to be a part of the parent unit again, despite the fact that you will see the sprites continuing to walk back like this. Um, the game considers it that they're already part of the parent unit, and in fact, if I were to do something like take the unit and maybe change formation or try to move them or something. Um, Sometimes that can make these units instantly kind of disappear and become part of the unit again. It didn't here, but sometimes that can happen. Uh, but anyway, these skirmish units are now part of the line unit again. So getting back to what happens when you do that, the moment a unit is about to be charged, is it causes the offending enemy unit that's charging you to lose their target. And what happens is they stop to reform. So if an enemy battalion was moving forward here and they went to charge this skirmisher unit, and I go to recall them, they now stop to reform. So once there is no kind of point in the game where an infantry unit is more vulnerable than when they're changing formation. They're absolutely at their most vulnerable when they're changing formation. So at that point, when that happens, we have a number of different options. Now, if you know that this is what you're going to do ahead of time, you can actually say, okay, here comes the enemy unit. They're going to charge me. I'm going to take this unit, form them up in assault column, right? And then just sit here and wait. And we'll go ahead and put the skirmish unit kind of back out here again, right? And we'll double click them and we'll just put them right out in front here. There you go. Speed up time. Get over there, fellas. Okay, so now we have the skirmish unit back in place. Let me pause the game again. And, an enemy unit is coming forward, and you say, okay, these guys are going to charge. They're close enough. I'm going to recall the skirmisher unit. What that's going to do is instantly invalidate the skirmisher unit as a target. The enemy unit that's charging will lose its target, and they'll be forced to reform. While they're reforming, right, you grab this unit. It's not here because we're not in a combat situation, but if we were, the charge button would be right here. Hit that charge button, and boom, you have a 540 man assault column plunging into an enemy unit that's in the middle of reforming. And that's almost a surefire way of knocking them out before they ever have a chance to do any real damage. So that's one thing I'll do. Let's go ahead and put this unit back into line. Now, let's say let's say you're watching a big battle or something, and you're not paying attention. You get caught off guard, and you come back here to your formation, and all of a sudden, your skirmishers are, oh no, they've been charged, they're retreating, and this unit here is being charged by an enemy unit, and they're in the middle of a melee, and they lose, and now the enemy has both push back your skirmishers, and now they've driven in your line unit. That's why we have this assault column here, right? So this assault column is basically your backup, your countercharging force. So if you come back and something crazy's happened, and we don't need to do this all for demonstration purposes, you guys can go back to where you were. And again, after every charge, the AI will always stop to reform, right? So they'll hit the skirmisher unit, they'll stop to reform, they'll get shot at by the line unit. But if they charge again and you're not paying attention and they get into a melee, they might win this melee, they might lose it, but they could win it. And if they win it, you have the option of being able to counterattack with your assault column behind here. Now, this is going to be a fresh unit, and at this point, the enemy has already been involved in a melee, and it may very well have been a costly melee. And your unit here is probably going to have the advantage going into a charge. If you're lucky, you could catch them while they're in the middle of reforming. You're an assault column. That gives you a 15% advantage as far as on the attack. If you're in assault column and enemy units are not in assault column, you have a 15% advantage going into a melee. So right away, we've seen that this version of the fortress is not as static as the cavalry version. As I said, the cavalry version is basically only meant to be used against enemy cavalry. It's basically set up and forget it. You don't have to do anything. But that's because enemy cavalry only has one mode of attack, the charge. If you stop the charge, you stop the cavalry. Squares stop the cavalry, and so stop the charge. And that's really all there is to it. But infantry has more than one mode of attack, and more than one way of coming at you with different modes of attacks. So infantry can both shoot and charge. So that makes that makes it so that you have to uh, maybe adapt this formation to meet different challenges that are presented to it. Um, so if if enemy infantry set up in line and they basically want to shoot it out with you, and they're not making any um, kind of aggressive moves towards you, well, then you can maybe adapt this formation to better fit that situation. That okay, these guys are, uh, uh, they want to sit here and shoot it out with us. It's going to be I can see that this is going to be a firefight. And we'll always have the advantage in that firefight because we have the artillery. But we can make things maybe even more to our advantage by saying, well, okay, so they're not going to charge us, so depth of defense is not as important. So maybe what if we do something like extend the line, right? So we can take our line infantry units, right, and maybe move them out on either side because we're not being charged, so we don't need a counterattacking force, right? So we can just kind of maybe extend our line here, right? And if we want, again, we have a line unit that we keep in rear of the artillery battery that's a source of skirmishers. So if we're not being charged and the enemy are relatively timid, well, then, we could grab a skirmisher unit, and I'm just waiting for it to flip here. So the toolbar flips, and okay, let's put some skirmishers out front and do the same thing on this side, right? And put them out here, right? And I'll speed up time so we can see what this looks like. All right, there we go. All right, so now, right, well, I would finesse, this is a little rough. I would finesse this a little bit, maybe, just give that a little tweak. And yeah, I'm a stickler for lines, guys. I like them neat and orderly. Move the skirmisher unit in, and all right, so now we've almost doubled the length of our line. We have skirmisher units out in front of our line units, screening them. And one of the main reasons I do this, and this is another one of those core tactics that I use, and it's almost automatic to me, is anytime I'm going to have units involved in combat, whether line units or cavalry or artillery, I almost always will try to screen them with skirmishers. And one of my favorite things to say, and I've said it before in the main series or in other videos that I've done, is that screening your own units with your skirmishers is I liken it to the Starship Enterprise in Star Trek putting up its shields, because whenever you put skirmishers in front of something of yours, that's basically what you're doing. You're putting up your shields, because skirmishers have an inherent defense bonus, and it's a lot. It's like, I don't know, 45-50%. It's a huge defense bonus just for being a skirmisher unit. So in many ways, I consider skirmisher units to almost be like movable defensive terrain. So if I were to move this unit here into like the woods here, they would get a defensive terrain benefit from being in the woods. In terms of, it would be a percentage in damage reduction in terms of how many losses they suffer. But skirmishers accomplish virtually the same thing just by being skirmisher units. And when you place skirmisher units in front of your own friendly units, they screen them. So not only do they impart this defensive bonus that they get just by being a skirmisher unit on themselves, but anything behind them. And that's kind of the main reason I do that. There's really no negative to screening all your forces with skirmishers any chance you get. There's no drawback to it. The only drawback is you have to pay attention, because skirmishers are, of course, vulnerable to being charged. But I have my own strategies in and of itself that involve around baiting units into charging skirmishers. One of the main reasons I keep a unit back here to be the source of skirmishers is that I am doing this with the acceptance of knowing that my skirmishers are going to get driven off from time to time. And more often than not, I'm going to recall them myself just to get them out of the charge. Because when I do that, I know I'm forcing the enemy unit that's charging them to stop and reform because they've lost their target. The result of this is that what I end up doing is just cycling the same skirmisher units in and out of the battle. Um, and it basically turns into a kind of a limitless source of manpower because I'm cycling them back to a unit that's not engaged in combat. So I withdraw them, I have them retreat, or I recall them. However it is, the most important thing is that I'm baiting enemy units, whether it's infantry or cavalry, into wasting charges on nothing more than a skirmisher unit and getting nothing for it. Because most of the time, that's not to say I never get caught off guard where I wasn't paying attention or I just wasn't looking at that particular skirmish unit and the unit actually gets charged. But more often than not, I will catch the charge before it happens and I'll be able to simply unsplit the unit before the charge hits them. So the skirmisher unit loses nothing because I've simply recalled them, but I've forced the enemy unit into wasting a charge on a target that they've lost, and they have to stop and reform. And in that time, they're going to be fired on by the line unit. They're going to be fired on by the other enemy, the other skirmishers. They're going to be fired on at close range by the artillery. They're going to take a lot of casualties in a short span of time just for having wasted a charge on a skirmisher unit they couldn't even get to. Now, some of these tactics sound cheap. Uh, it's because they are. And as I said, this goes back to a philosophy of gaming I have that goes all the way back to my uh, competitive fighting game days, where the goal is to win. And largely speaking, in fighting games, you win by any means legally possible. Uh, if that means doing, 3 throws in a row, or 4 throws, or 5 throws over and over and over again, if it keeps working and the enemy opponent just sits there blocking and taking the throws, you do it. Is it cheap? Yeah. Um, but ultimately, the philosophy of gameplay that I have is that winning is the most important thing. Um, and that's not to say that that's the right way to play this game. I am not making that statement. I've never made that statement. There is no right or wrong way to play this game. So I'm not telling you how to play the game. I'm not insisting you play the game with my mentality or my philosophy. Not at all. This game's about having fun, and however you choose to have fun, so be it. But understanding my mentality and my philosophy is understanding how these formations came to exist in the first place. Because people with my mentality, people with my philosophy, or I'm sorry, people that don't have my philosophy, people that don't have my mentality when it comes to playing games like this, those are not the people that come up with stuff like this. This stuff is cheap and it's meant to be cheap. It's meant to control every aspect of the engagement, from the distance management, the formation management, and the engagement management. It's all meant to give myself all the advantages and control every aspect of an engagement, and at the same time deny those same options and those same advantages to the AI. It's meant to make all engagements as lopsided for me as possible. And as I said, historically, that's probably not how Napoleonic battles were fought, and I'm not one to disagree with that assessment. But this is a video game, and I play video games to win. And that mentality and that philosophy is what led me to come up with a lot of this stuff. Is it was designed around not only how can I win, but how can I win handedly? How can I win easily? How can I do the most damage to the enemy with the least amount of effort on my part? And that's largely to understand my mentality and to understand my philosophy of gameplay is to understand how these formations came to exist in the first place, how I created them. So yeah, that basically covers kind of the options that infantry has, and again, this is mostly this is a formation I would use if I was only dealing with enemy infantry. This has nothing to do with any enemy cavalry. There's no enemy cavalry involved. I know I'm just facing enemy infantry. As you can see, there's no squares present. No, it has nothing to do with enemy cavalry. So both of these formations were meant to deal with completely different styles of attack. So the cavalry fortress is just meant to deal with enemy cavalry. The infantry fortress is just meant to deal with enemy infantry. As I said, the cavalry fortress is a completely static formation because of the fact that cavalry only has one mode of attack: stop the charge, and you stop the cavalry. Squares stop the charge, they stop the cavalry. You don't need to do anything. Just let your square shoot away at the cavalry, let your guns bomb away, and the enemy cavalry will just keep coming forward, keep getting knocked back, keep coming forward, getting knocked back, and you're basically just not taking any losses at all, unless they have any horse guns back here that may, occasionally, drop a few men in your square or whatever. But nothing serious. You're going to inflict much more casualties on them than they will on you. And likewise, the infantry fortress was meant to deal with enemy infantry, because enemy infantry has different modes of attack. The infantry fortress is not as static as it is not as static as the cavalry fortress. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there as my phone just started blowing up in my face for some reason. So yeah, there are a couple of other nuances I could talk about in the with regards to the infantry fortress, but I think I'm going to come back to them because I think it really the only thing I have to cover with regards to the infantry fortress is the fact that it doesn't work the way it is here, or even with the assault columns. It doesn't work if your enemy units are really high quality troops, such as the Coldstream Guard on the Allied side, or the French Imperial Guard, troops that are just insanely good, level 7, level 8 troops. Now, this happens to be the Imperial Guard I'm using here, so these are very, very good troops. So it would work for them, but nobody else. Generally speaking, the infantry fortress does not work against troops that are very high troop quality, because they don't care how many layers of defense you have. They'll barrel through your skirmishers. You can recall them. It doesn't matter. They'll charge through your line unit. They'll demolish them. You can countercharge them with your assault column. It won't matter. They'll demolish them too. Guard units are virtually unbeatable in hand-to-hand combat, and so if it comes down to that, the infantry fortress alone by itself cannot defend the guns, because uh, um, guard level troops just simply, they're just better troops. They have better morale, better combat ability, better fatigue. They can charge over and over and over again and still get the job done. Uh, uh, and they'll just demolish any other infantry that you send against them. Presumably, assuming that your troops are not guard level troops themselves, like our units are. You can see these troops here are the absolute best troops in the game. They're chasseurs of the Imperial Guard. I just happen to end up picking those troops to use to set up these formations here. But ordinarily speaking, if you were just using run-of-the-mill level 5, level 6 troops, which make up the majority of the French army, they would not stand against guard level troops if the guard troops chose to charge them. But I'm going to come back to that, because a lot of what I'm going to explain about how to deal with that really also has to do with combined arms as a whole. And that leads us to our buddy over here, which is the full combined arms fortress. So this here is the kind of the final version of the fortress, the fortress in its highest form, so to speak, the Super Saiyan fortress. Uh, and You'll notice that it shares. The first thing you'll notice is it shares commonalities with both the infantry and cavalry versions of the fortress, with some noticeable differences, but we'll get to that. So, like the cavalry fortress, it is made up of squares in the front, just like the cavalry fortress you can see over here. Just like the cavalry fortress, it has batteries. It has a battery deployed behind it at such a range so that when the guns unlimber, they will unlimber right behind the squares. However, just like the infantry fortress, you will notice we screen everything. So we have skirmishers out in front of the squares, and we have skirmishers out in front of the battery. And also, likewise, we have, well, they're not there anymore, but originally these units here were deployed in assault column, and we'll just send them back there because that'll be part of what we're talking about dealing with next. So we might as well getting them moved back there. But anyway, initially, before I was kind of going off on what you could do to adapt the fortress here, initially I had it deployed so that these units here were deployed in assault column behind the line units. So I'm just going to kind of place them back here and do that. And you notice we have a very similar setup here. So we also have assault columns in rear of the squares. Also, like the infantry fortress, we have a line unit positioned behind the battery, and they are deployed in such a way to, again, be a source of skirmishers. So we have all of these skirmisher units are, again, deployed from this line unit. So again, the forward units are all able to stay at full strength, both the squares and the assault columns, but we are able to have skirmishers because they're coming from the line unit in rear of the battery. And you'll also notice that I also have cavalry squadrons positioned on either side of the assault column. The cavalry has no real position within the fortress itself. You could have them here, you could have them back here, you could have them pretty much anywhere as long as they're nearby, because they don't actually play a static role in the fortress. And we'll get to what I use cavalry for as I develop here. So this formation here is meant to handle anything that can be thrown at it. Any combination of infantry, skirmishers, and I'm sorry, I had to take a drink there. I was getting dry mouth. Any combination of infantry, skirmishers, and cavalry. Now, again, enemy artillery on the advance, same thing. Even if they're coming forward, the moment they come within engaged distance of small arms, they'll turn around, back up. They're usually not an issue. So let's talk about some of the possibilities of what happens when a combined enemy formation comes forward. Well, let's say they lead off with their infantry. So if they lead off with their infantry, right, and let's say they lead off with some of their line infantry, well, that's why we have the skirmishers out here, right? So if the enemy units form line and want to shoot it out with us, the idea here is that we have the skirmishers screening the squares, and this is important to do because if you didn't have these here and you just had enemy line units shooting at squares, that's a terrible mismatch for the squares. Squares shoot out of any one side of the square at a severely reduced strength because obviously 75% of their manpower is facing a different direction. So on any one side of the square, they're shooting at a severely reduced strength compared to, say, an enemy unit in line formation with kind of all of its manpower facing in one direction. So the enemy line unit, if it was just shooting at a square, would have a huge advantage in that they would just immediately start shooting out the side of these squares. But as I mentioned before, skirmishers are like putting up the shields. when you put skirmishers in front of anything, you screen them, and they impart that inherent defense bonus of being a skirmisher unit on anything that's they're screening. So if an enemy line unit comes forward and deploys into line and starts shooting it out with our skirmishers, um, they're at an immediate disadvantage because skirmishers will almost always uh, get the better of a line unit because uh, skirmisher units are harder to hit than line units are. So the skirmisher units will have an easier time inflicting losses on the line unit than the line unit will on inflicting losses on the skirmisher unit. But moreover, uh, we can do something else to equal the odds even more in our favor. And this has the added bonus of being able to stop enemy units from charging at all. We're basically saying the only thing you can do is set up either way back here in line or come forward, and we're going to take our cavalry and bring them forward, right? And force the enemy infantry unit into square. So cavalry has an engagement range, and it's like 200 yards, 250 yards, somewhere in there. I forget the exact number, but at any rate, close enough so that any enemy unit that comes within here is going to come within engage range of our cavalry and be forced into square. So if they come forward and want to charge, they can't because they're gonna have to form square because our cavalry is right here. Now you notice I just have one squadron here, right? And that's all it takes because we don't play um, games of firepower. This is about engagement and formation control and distance management, not about firepower. So this squadron only has 100 men in it, but it doesn't matter. It's still cavalry, right? So you could have a whole brigade coming forward. You could have 2, 3 battalions coming forward. And it doesn't matter. This one squadron is capable of forming any unit that comes within its engage range into square because it's just an engagement distance thing. So we could take one little squadron here and make them pay huge dividends just by forcing maybe 2 or 3 enemy battalions into square. Now, what does that do for us? So that does a couple of things for us. One, we have now uh, made it so that our skirmishers are now shooting at maybe 2 or 3 squares out here at a huge advantage because skirmishers versus squares is a huge advantage. The squares would be lucky if they hit the skirmishers at all. So now not only do we have enemy units forced into square out here, we have skirmishers shooting at them, and our squares are protected behind our skirmishers. We have other skirmisher units here that can also shoot at them. We have our artillery out here that is, shooting a canister at them. So all of this inflicts maximum carnage on the enemy very quickly. At the same time, it limits what they can do to basically come forward and form square. And if you guys really want to see this in action, I highly recommend watching uh, part 4 of my French Battle of Waterloo. Um, I forget the episode number. I think it's maybe 29. No, can't be 29. Maybe it's like 34, 35. I forget the episode number. But if you go into like my full battles playlist, um, and look for the French Battle of Waterloo, I titled it just in French, like Les Batailles de Mont Saint Jean or something like that. And click on part 4 and scroll to about halfway through it, and you will see I have basically a whole ring of these type of formations set up uh, uh, on the right side of the French line, and I basically let the Prussian forces come forward and basically beat themselves to death against it. And you can really see some of the abusive tactics that I use, exactly as I'm describing here, to manipulate the enemy engagement distances. An even better example of it is one I recently just did. Uh, where I covered the French full battle of Les Safel, and in part one of that up at the town of Mundelsheim, where we actually did have to defend against Hessian guard level troops. And you will see me use this formation as well as just have a lot of cavalry within the lines to manipulate. Now, I did not use squares in that really because I was not tangling with any enemy cavalry. I was only tangling with enemy infantry and artillery. So I wasn't set up like this. I was more set up like this. Where did my other unit go? Where did you guys go? Didn't I have another unit? Oh, that was this unit, right? Oh, I placed them right on top of each other. I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot. There we go. Get back there. Uh, I was dealing with more of a formation like this, but we were dealing with Hessian guard level troops, which, as I said, they were just without enemy cavalry. Guard level troops would just barrel right through all of this. So I did use cavalry in order to force them into square, not because I necessarily wanted the formational advantage of having them in square, though that always helps, but because it's the only way to stop guard level troops from charging you is to force them into square. Um, so I'll use stuff like this in order to basically stop enemy infantry, force them into square, and basically control all the engagements myself. Now, let's say, as I said, this formation is meant to deal with any combination of combined arms. So let's assume the enemy also have cavalry. Usually, 9 times out of 10, the first thing the cavalry will do is, or the first thing the cavalry will do is seek to get rid of the skirmishers. And the reason they do that is because what they want to do is they'll bring their line infantry up, set up their infantry outside of range where my cavalry can force them into square, unless I want to bring the cavalry forward of the fortress, which I don't recommend doing because that leaves them vulnerable. So I usually try to keep my cavalry kind of either on the side of the fortress or behind it, but under the protection of the fortress. So if the enemy line units come forward just enough so that they can set up in line but be out of range of being forced into square, what the enemy cavalry will try to do is force the skirmishers uh, uh, off the position, right? So they'll charge the skirmishers. You can either recall them, retreat them, whatever. But the point is, the enemy cavalry has now forced your skirmishers to vacate the position in front of the square, leaving the square vulnerable to being fired on by enemy infantry. Now, this is the game where you're playing kind of a game of persistence with the AI, in that you basically want to force them to do this over and over and over again, right? So your square is going to be fine for a few minutes taking fire from enemy infantry, because in order for the enemy infantry to remain in line, they have to be far enough away so that they're out of the engage range of the cavalry. And if something like this has happened, I will push that. I'll bring the cavalry up as close as I possibly can to keep them both within protection of the fortress. And like I said, usually I set these things up in a ring. I don't just have a static one formation like this. I'll have a ring of them. So very likely, one fortress ends and another one will begin here, and I'll have another square right here, and then another battery of artillery and another square and another. I'll extend the ring. So when I bring a squadron up in here, it's between two squares. They're not going to be charged by enemy cavalry or enemy, because they're protected by the squares, and the squares are, in front. But I'll bring the cavalry up in order to, move their engagement range forward. So anything within 200 yards of the squadron is going to have to form square. So, even if the enemy cavalry do come forward and run my skirmishers off, the enemy infantry is going to have to be far enough back that they're able to form line and not be within engage distance of this cavalry because it's just an engagement distance thing. If they're within range of the cavalry, they're just going to form square automatically on their own. And if they're not, they'll form line. But far back like this, they're not going to inflict really crazy losses on the square. Even though line units do have an advantage against shooting at the square, because we're controlling the distance at which they can stay in line, if they choose to stay in line back here, they're not really going to be able to inflict a whole heck of a lot of damage on the square. So what happens is the enemy cavalry will come forward, charge your squares. Like I said, you can either recall them, retreat them, and then the cavalry will stop to reform. They'll be stuck out here now. They're going to get shot at by the square. They're going to be shot at by the other skirmishers. They're going to be hit with canister from the guns. They'll get driven off. And this is where the game of who wants it the most comes in. Except you're playing it with nothing but skirmisher units that you keep recycling, and you're making the enemy play it with very valuable cavalry. Cavalry is is kind of one of your most precious assets on the battlefield in this game in terms of being able to control enemy formations. I don't normally use cavalry as an offensive weapon. The only time I do is when enemy units actually just give me that opportunity, but I don't look for it. If an enemy unit is just sitting out here in line and I move my squadron out here and they don't form square, they're basically handing me their head and on a platter. And at that point, okay, I'm going to charge you and get you out of there, but only because you're just giving me that option. But that's not how I inherently try to use cavalry in this game. Cavalry is nothing more to me than a way to control enemy formations and control the engagement distances. So when you use it that way, you find you don't need vast amounts of cavalry. And you can see that I have vast amounts of cavalry back here. But I can control a very large portion of my front just with a couple of squadrons, maybe a brigade. So maybe I would grab like any brigades back here. So, okay, maybe I'd grab like a brigade, right? And bring them up here and just have a cavalry brigade. And we're just going to speed up time here real quick just to get them up to the front in rear. But this one cavalry brigade would back up maybe 3 or 4 of these type of infantry or these type of combined arms fortress formations. Because I don't actually need any more than maybe 1 or 2 squadrons per formation because I'm not using them in a kind of offensive capacity. I'm just using them for the fact that if enemy units approach within a certain range, I'm forcing them into square just by having them here. And that's really all I want to do with it, is force enemy units into square. Why do I do that? Well, I stop them from being able to charge. I stop them from being able to come within a certain range without having to then form square. Okay, our enemy brigade is up here, or I'm sorry, our cavalry brigade is up here. So let's assume now that we have this formation extended in multiple variations of this. So we have, out here we have another square, then another battery with more skirmishers, more squares, more skirmishers in front of the batteries and more assault columns, and kind of the same idea we have here. And we're just extending it outward from either the right or the left and just making this brick wall formation. Well, with this one brigade of cavalry here, I can cover this fortress that would be here or this fortress that would be here and implement these same distance management controls with very few very few numbers of my own cavalry squadrons because of the way I'm trying to use them. And this makes your own cavalry virtually triple in value, as if you were trying. I'm sorry, I kind of said what I meant to say there. It makes your cavalry virtually triple in value compared to if you were to use them in a kind of a conventional historical way, because you're able to make them be much more important per squadron than they would be if you were just trying to do things like massed cavalry charges. I almost never do massed cavalry charges in this game, unless it's in like cavalry scenarios where something like that is specifically called for. And there are a few of those, but in this game. But generally speaking, this is how I use cavalry. Very small amounts, and it's nothing more than an engagement distance control. So if we then extend this line of thinking here, we could take another squadron, right, and we could put them with another fortress on, on the left side, or even this one squadron here would basically be covering, not only the right of this fortress, but they'd be covering the left of the next fortress, and we could take another squadron and put them in between another fortress and so forth. And if enemy units come out here in the center, you can always bring another one and maybe put them right up behind the skirmishers if you need to. Again, if enemy units come up in the center, you can do the same thing, enforce that engagement distance control from the center, until they are out of there. Now you might block some line of sight of some of your guns, but you're not going to block all of them. Especially if you keep them in column by division like this. Um, your guns out here will still have a clear line of sight. Your guns here would still have a line of sight. In fact, I'm not even sure, to be honest with you, whether cavalry squadrons actually block line of sight, because cavalry can actually move right through infantry like it's not even there. And I've just never needed to kind of explore whether cavalry blocks line of sight anyway, because you would never use cavalry as a screening force to block musket balls. You wouldn't want them to do that because cavalry is valuable, and you don't want them to take losses. You'd be much better off to have infantry skirmishers screen the cavalry, because they're not going to take anywhere near as many losses because they're skirmisher units and they'll protect the cavalry. So if you do something like this, now you have your left, your center, and your right completely engaged distance controlled by the fact that you have cavalry squadrons in place throughout the fortress. So at this point now, you can't even be charged by infantry, because any enemy infantry that comes forward has to stop and form square. So all they can do is stay outside of engagement distance and form line and try and shoot it out either with your skirmishers or at worst your squares. And as I said, enemy cavalry will almost always look to charge your squares and get them out of there, mostly because that's honestly all they can do, because again, we're controlling the engagement distance and we're controlling what the cavalry has a choice of targeting. And since these skirmishers are out front, that's kind of the only choice the cavalry has. So they'll charge the skirmishers, get them out of there, and then your square will shoot at the cavalry. These skirmishers will shoot at the cavalry. Your artillery will shoot at the cavalry and drive them off. As soon as they drive them off, bam, click on your unit, re-kick out the skirmishers, put them right back out there. You're basically telling the enemy, every time you want to get rid of these skirmisher units to give your line units back here a shooting chance against these squares, you're going to have to spend cavalry to do it. That's what you're telling the enemy. You're saying you want these squares gone, spend the cavalry charge. You're going to have to do it. And you're going to recall the skirmisher unit or retreat them and recall them, or whatever it is you're going to do. Even if you then retreat them and then recall them and kick out fresh units, which I always advise doing, is cycling in as many fresh units as you can. Because what's going to happen over time is the enemy cavalry is going to waste charge after charge after charge. And this may take a while. As I said, this is a game of persistence. You're basically telling the enemy that this is what you have to do to get my skirmisher units out from in front of these squares, and I am never, not for an instant, I'm never going to give you a break. I'm never going to let you rest back here and not have these skirmishers out here. Every time you shoot at the cavalry and force them to withdraw, these skirmishers come right back up, and you give the cavalry no rest for the weary, so we say, and keep forcing them to do this. And every time they do, they're going to waste their fatigue and spend men and spend charges and waste their time and gain nothing from it, because every single time the same thing is going to happen. They're going to come forward. They're going to drive off your skirmishers, whether you recall them, whether you retreat them and then recall them and then kick out fresh ones afterwards. The same thing is always going to happen. They're going to come forward, drive off the skirmishers, stop and reform. They can't charge anything else because they're right in front of the square. Square's going to shoot at them. Skirmishers are going to shoot at them. Artillery is going to shoot at them. They're going to get driven off, and you immediately put the skirmishes right back here. And you just keep playing this game and forcing the enemy cavalry to squander its cavalry on fruitless charges against skirmishers. While we're using our cavalry simply as engagement distance control. We're not losing any cavalrymen because we either have them screened by skirmishers, or we have them back behind the protection of the squares, and the enemy can't use their cavalry to force our units into square because, well, guess what? Our units are already in square. That's already accounted for, right? So the whole basis of this formation is being, again, going back to what I called combined arms in this game. Rock, paper, scissors. You can't out rock, paper, scissors a formation that has rock, paper, scissors built into it. And that's what this formation does. It has rock, paper, scissors built into the formation, in that any option the enemy has to come forward is already covered just by the way this formation is. You know, so if enemy skirmishers want to tangle it out with our skirmishers, fine, go for it. Skirmishers versus skirmishers basically is a wash. They cancel each other out. But we have the guns, and we're going to inflict heavier losses on enemy skirmishers than they are on us because we have the guns. Because this formation is set up ahead of time in anticipation of an enemy attack, while enemy units have to come forward and engage us. And they don't get to do this. They don't get to set up a defensive formation because they're the ones on the attack, and we have already set up our defensive formation. Again, whatever the context is in the given scenario I'm playing, whether I'm defending an objective that I already possess and I just have to hold it, whether I have already attacked an objective, I've taken it, and now I'm flopping over to the defensive. The point of the matter is I'm holding the ground that both of us want, you know, and you have to now come forward and attack it. And you don't get to do this because I've already beaten you to it. I've done it. I've set up the rock, paper, scissors formation. I now have all the options covered. And this is what I was talking about before when I said this is a formation that seeks to give myself all the advantages and deny all those same advantages to the enemy. And that's really what this does. So it covers all the bases. You know, like I said, skirmishers, we always have the advantage because we have the guns. That's the key part of this whole formation, is that we will always have the guns and we will always have them in close range. If you want to come forward and engage this formation, you're going to have to deal with guns at close range. And we don't have to deal with that because that's not the way artillery works on the advance. If you try and advance artillery to a formation that's already set up like this, you can't, because limbered artillery will turn around. So we never have to deal with that. All we're ever going to have to deal with is skirmishers, infantry, and artillery. And this beats them to every punch because we already have a multi-dimensional setup that deals with all different possible combinations that the enemy can come at us with. But we have the guns, and they don't. And that's ultimately what it really is, the biggest advantage of this formation. I said once in a video that artillery at close range is the entire meta of this game. And meta is an anagram that means most effective tactic available, or sometimes most efficient tactic available. And this formation is both. It's the most effective tactic available, and it's the most efficient because while it does require some adaptation and some watching on your part compared to what it would be in a crazy battle if you weren't using formations like this, it's nothing compared to that. So it's the most efficient and it's the most effective formation in the game. Um, yeah, I think that pretty much kind of covers uh, kind of all the ideas behind um, the main philosophies behind these different variations of the fortress. There are certain you can intermingle them. They're not wholly divisible. A lot of times you will see me do things like set up a cavalry formation, fortress formation, and then maybe convert into the combined arms formation, or set up an infantry formation, and then maybe I'll see enemy cavalry coming down and I'll convert into the combined arms fortress, or maybe I set up with a combined arms fortress and I end up only facing enemy infantry, and I'll gradually transition into a more infantry oriented formation like this. So they can be molded back and forth to kind of fit whatever it is um, whatever situation is being presented to you, which is why I call all of these the fortress. I don't make any kind of distinction in terms of the way I name them, because ultimately they are just different variations on a theme. They're all about um, controlling the engagement distance, um, and controlling the formational advantage, while being able to bring your artillery to the most effective range. So I call all of these formations the fortress because that's really what they are, and these are all just variations on a theme. Um, and they aren't necessarily independent of one another. You can start with one, convert into another, take different aspects of one and apply it to another. You know, if I have an infantry, if I'm tangling with a high level infantry force here, maybe I'm playing, some Dutch Belgian units here that are just garbage level troops. Maybe their troop level, is 4 or 5. Just real mediocre run-of-the-mill troops, and the chasseurs of the French Imperial Guard are advancing on me. Well, this isn't going to stop them, is it? The French Imperial Guard will laugh at this and come forward and just destroy it, because they'll advance in hand-to-hand combat and just destroy all of this, because this would be a light morning snack for the French Imperial Guard. Um, if I were Dutch Belgian units, so to speak. But by bringing a couple of my cavalry squadrons over here, right, and putting maybe one here, one up in here, and one here, well, that changes everything, because now these units can no longer advance. They'll come within engaged distance of the cavalry, be forced into square, and now I've got all the advantages. Now I've forced you into square, so now my skirmishers are shooting at you with a huge advantage. You can no longer move forward because squares are a static formation. You can't move in square. If you try to move, you're going to move out of square first. You're going to move into column by division. So, like, if I try to move this square forward, you'll see it may reform square, but at first they're going to go into column by division. So they're going to lose their square, and at this point they're very vulnerable. So you can't actually move um, and hold square formation while you're moving the way you can with, say, line. Like if I hover over this line hold form, that means when I go to move, if I say click on a unit that's in line and click line hold form, they will move, but they won't form column by division. They will stay in line and move as a line. But you can't do that in square. So when you when you force a unit into square with cavalry, they're stuck there. So now it doesn't matter if these uh, uh, are guard level troops, if they're made out of, if they're all superheroes from the Marvel universe. It doesn't matter. The rules in this game say if you come within range of cavalry, you stop and form square. So once that happens, then the troop quality is basically completely taken out of the equation, and now it's just a matter of formational control. And we're the ones controlling the formation because we're the ones with the cavalry forcing them into square. And if they have no cavalry, we get to plop away on them with skirmishers. There's nothing they can do about it. We have the battery at close range. There's nothing they can do about it. They're stuck in square. Sit there and hold that. You're going to just eat it. And if cavalry later on comes up, well, we can transition into this, form the units that are in line and form them into square. If we need more cavalry, we can bring it up. The point is that once you understand how all of these um, units are able to control enemy formations and engagement distances, you're able to basically move back and forth between different versions of the fortress in kind of whatever variation you need, and control that all important uh, engagement distance and formational control. If you can master those two aspects of this game, I'll let you in on a secret. You have mastered the game, because that's what this game is all about: engagement distance control and formation control. If you control those two things and become a master at that, you've mastered the game, because that's how I mastered the game. And that's really all there is to it. Now, when I say that's really all there is to it, I know I'm making that sound easier than it is. I'm a veteran. I've been playing this game for many, many years. All of this stuff is second nature to me, in that I'm able to implement it quickly and efficiently. The Grog toolbar itself is an extension of my brain. I don't have to hover and look for stuff. I know it instinctively. Um, and things like if I'm going to split off different cavalry squadrons from the same brigade to cover multiple fortresses, things like detaching said squadron, if I want to click on them and detach. You can see I already did. I did it without even thinking. So I have this squadron detached, so they're not going to respond to any brigade level commands. I can just kind of split them off, and use them how I see fit. So when I say it's as simple as that, I don't mean to suggest that this is easy, and that implementing these engagement distance protocols or these formation control protocols is going to be something that you're just going to see this and go, okay, I know how to do this, and be able to implement it perfectly. Guys, I really needed a lot of practice at doing this, even after I came up with it. And even though I had the impetus and the mostly the fleshed out ideas for the fortress before I ever started making videos on YouTube, I've been making videos on YouTube now for, I think, almost 2 years. And I can look back at some of my earlier videos of me using the fortress, and I can tell you I am way better at using the fortress now than I was back then. So even though I had already come up with the whole impetus and the idea behind the fortress, years ago, even today I'm still getting better at using it. And even years from now, I may look back at this video and go, God, Rob, you scrub, you know nothing compared to what I know now about how to use the fortress. But the point of me in what I'm saying is that even though I may say something the game is really boils down to something as simple as formation control and engagement distance control. I'm by no means seeing this is easy to do. Um, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of scenario knowledge. Obviously, setting up formations like this um, in key positions first requires you to know what those key positions are. It requires a lot of scenario knowledge and how do scenarios unfold. And if I'm on the defense, where are the enemy going to be attacking from? What's coming forward first? What are they leading with? Are they leading with cavalry? Are they leading with artillery? Are they leading with infantry? Um, you know, for a lot of scenarios in this game for new players, these are not going to be things you're going to be able to implement the first or second or third time you're playing a scenario, because you don't even know what the hell's going to happen in the scenario. You're brand new to it. But I've played every scenario in this game literally dozens of times each, thousands of times total. I've played every scenario in this game. Well, maybe not thousands, but hundreds, certainly. So I have just a huge depth of scenario knowledge as far as what is going to happen in these scenarios. And a lot of this stuff I came up with through replays because, especially in the early game like Scourge of War Waterloo and then maybe the Quatre Bras expansion, when those first came out, you're going back to 2015, 2016 when I was still learning how to play this game. And I didn't have it all figured out. So, I would play scenarios in Scourge of War Waterloo, and the first 10 times I played them, I get my head handed to me because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So a lot of the stuff I discovered just through replay after replay after replay of the same scenario over and over again, and just a sort of kind of an absurd determination on my part in saying I'm gonna figure out how to win one way or another. I'm gonna figure this out. And maybe a better military commander than myself would have figured it out sooner. But I don't really consider myself a military commander. Military commanders have to get it right the first time, and I'm notoriously not too good at that. I'm good at getting it better, at getting it right, the 20th time. But once I get it right, it's not only going to be right, it's going to be unbeatable, and it's going to be a way that I would never ever lose a scenario again because I didn't just figure out how to win, I figured out how to dominate. And that's sort of covers my journey through how my playing of this game led me to create some of these formations, and led me to kind of evolve them and build them into the most effective defensive formations in the game. The fortress is going on 3.5 years old now since I basically came up with the impetus for it, and it's still to this day the strongest formation, the strongest defensive formation in the game. I've never found anything better. I have added to it in terms of growing from this, which was the most basic kind of static idea for it, to this, to extending it and creating huge lines built on this concept. And how I integrate all three arms into it. Certainly that has evolved over time, and I've finessed it over time, and it continues to evolve. The more I play the game, the better I get at harnessing the fortress's strengths. But this is basically the foundations at the core of my defensive style of play, and I am a defensive style of player at heart. That isn't to say in scenarios where I'm required to be on the offense, I can't carry out brutal attacks. And in a future video, I may go over some of my strategies on the attack. But generally speaking, in most of these scenarios, if I have to attack something, I only attack enough. With enough and as much as I need to get the job done, to capture whatever it is I'm trying to capture, whether it's an objective or a hill or a fort or whatever it is I need to capture. I'm just going to do as much as is required of me to get that job done and to get that position captured. And then I'm going to switch over to this. And go on the defensive because it's far easier to play defensively in this game and actually impose these formational and distance engagement controls on the enemy than it is to necessarily carry out a whole bunch of precision attacks that requires more control, more discipline, and more experience in watching a lot of what's going on at a time. It's not to say I can't do that as well. I absolutely can. And like I said, in a future video, I hope to share some of my attack strategies. But whether I continue to do videos on kind of my strategies and tactics, I guess will depend on how well this video is received. Like I said, it's largely aimed at people who are newly discovering my channel and maybe would wish for a series of video that's solely dedicated to strategies and tactics without necessarily any specifics on scenarios or too much of focusing on how the interface works, because I cover a lot of that in the Grog toolbar. So that was something I just wanted to try. Like I said, it was the idea kind of was sparked by a post I read on the Neurobsoft forums where someone was basically asking me about command and control and some of my strategies in the game and how I go about doing things. But I wanted to start with the easiest aspect of it. And by no means am I saying the stuff is easy, but it's the easiest aspect of it in terms of playing on the defense. And these are kind of my core foundations on which I build defenses. And like I said, these are just examples of kind of different variations of the fortress. And, as I said, they can be linked together, lengthened, and kind of whatever your imagination kind of uh, lets you do, so long as you're always able to impose these engagement and formational controls over every part of your front. So whether you want to, have a battery here, square, squadron, square, squadron, square, battery, whatever your imagination, dictates. And a lot of times it's largely dependent on, how many batteries you have available to use, because if I have an unlimited amount of batteries or I just have a ton of them, like in this is the Eagle Triumphs, which is the Battle of Ligny, I have a lot of batteries in this scenario. So you might very well see me do something like square, battery, square, battery, square, battery, or, square, battery, square, squadron, square, battery, whatever you want to do. Just, keep your assault columns in reserve. Remember to screen everything with skirmishers. They impart a huge defensive bonus on themselves for being skirmishers, as well as anything behind them. They are your shields. You put them up like the Enterprise would, and they will stop the phasers and photon torpedoes from getting through. Yeah, I think I'm just kind of being redundant now and basically repeating things I've already said. I tend to do that a lot, guys, but it's only because I really try to drive these points home and make them stick in your head by repeating them over and over again. And I'll probably continue to do that in future videos and in future scenarios. But hopefully this gives beginner players a better insight into some of the tactics and defensive formations I use, as well as the mindset it took me to be in to come up with these kind of things to begin with, and to help you see that it's really not about firepower. That's one of the most important things I can stress about this, being on the defense in this game and being able to hold off much bigger forces than your own size force, um, is that it's not about firepower. Firepower is the least important aspect of this game. And I'm trying to stress that it's much more about formational and engagement control. Control the distance, control the enemy formations, and you control the enemy. And that's kind of how it works in this game. So hopefully this helps out some of you newer players that have maybe seen me talk about the fortress in parts of other videos that I've done, but maybe I was talking about it in such a way that I was expecting players to already understand what it was because I had covered it in so many other previous videos. And here we have one video that basically kind of sums up kind of the most basic version of the fortress through the most advanced forms of the fortress and the philosophy and gameplay that led to me in designing them, and kind of taking it from the beginning so that you can kind of just come here to learn everything you need to learn about the fortress. And then when you see some of my other videos like the Le Safel video or the Battle of Waterloo or Mont Saint Jean, sabers versus bayonets, or stuff like that. You'll see these formations and go, after seeing this video, I know exactly what he's doing. This is exactly how he demonstrated it in that video, and it'll all make sense to you. Yeah, hopefully that does it, guys, for the fortress. And I hope you guys learned something from it, and I will see you guys for the next video. Take it easy, fellas.